Welcome to History Bites, a monthly video series produced by George Mason's Gunston Hall for people who want to learn about their rights and how those rights have changed from the American Revolution to today. We find experts and we ask those experts to make their research easily digestible in 30 minutes or less. This is the second in a three-part series about the history of protest and activism. I am your host, Dr. Kate Steir, and we are joined today by Dr. Alex Finn Macartney, who will be discussing his research on student protests and activism around the globe during the 1960s. Dr. Macartney is an assistant professor of the practice of the International Affairs at the George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs, where he also acts as Associate Director of the FAO Regional Skills Sustainment Initiative. He is a historian of radical politics and violence in modern Japan and modern Germany. His current book project, which is entitled Revolt Against Empire, Protest and Armed Resistance Against the Vietnam War in Japan and West Germany, explores exchanges between anti-Vietnam War groups in Japan, West Germany, and the United States in the 1960s and 70s. And before I turn it over to Dr. Macartney, I just want to frame this talk within the history of ideas about individual rights as expressed by George Mason in his 1776 Virginia Declaration of Rights. In Article 2, George Mason wrote that all power is vested in and consequently derived from the people, and that magistrates, or elected representatives, are their trustees and servants and at all times amenable to them. In Article 3, Mason went on to say that the government is or ought to be instituted for the common benefit, protection, and security of the people. And towards the end of the article, also said that the majority of the people have a right to reform, alter, or even abolish it. And historically, many US citizens have seen protest as a means of keeping elected officials their servants and amenable to their interests, and as a way of reforming the government between regularly scheduled elections. And schools where youngest citizens are coming into their political maturity for the first time are often central to these kinds of protests going back hundreds of years. At the same time, a lot of people have debated when student protests, particularly if that involves violence, as we'll be discussing later, veers out of protected political speech. And for example, in Article 15, George Mason said that the blessings of liberty could only be secured by moderation, temperance, and frugality. And many people have argued that college students can occasionally be intemperate, spend too much money, and maybe even a little bit immoderate. So with this knowledge in mind, I want to turn it over to Dr. Macartney to give us a case study of 1960s student protests and understanding the ways in which these rights have had to be redebated with the growth of new communications technology and a youth culture that could not have been imagined in the 18th century.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Steir, and for everyone at George Mason's Gunston Hall. It's a pleasure to be here speaking to you and to everyone online. I'm quickly going to bring up my slides. Okay. And so I'm going to start with two ways in this talk. The first is just going to talk briefly about the student as a historical actor. And I think when we as Americans think about the 1960s, and especially the year 1968, we often conjure some very common images. The hippies in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury, scenes of Vietnam battlefields projected onto screens into living rooms, and of course, campuses filled with young people advocating for their causes. The student protester in the 1960s has been held up as something of a main character in 1968 and continues to be an archetype of civil disobedience, I would argue, to this day. So why were students so prominent in the collective memory? In this talk, I'm going to briefly talk about how historians, and especially historians of the 1960s, approach students as historical actor and how that's changed. then present a story of Japan and West Germany students as examples of these trends and how we think about student protesters. So to begin, student political action and protest is by no means confined to the 1960s in the US or more globally, nor should we think about student politics as uniformly left-wing or particularly radical necessarily. While Japanese students that we're going to talk about here in the 1920s were key translators of Marxist texts from the Soviet Union, there were also in Germany white right-wing fraternities at universities that were some of the Nazis' best supporters. The SS, of course, unfortunately, was famous for having a disproportionate number of PhDs among their ranks. And neither in the 1960s should we think about the student movement as uniformly or homogenously left-wing. In the United States, many anti-communist students marched in support of the Vietnam War, for example. What's interesting in the West German case, at least, is that the conservative students often retroactively defined themselves as a part of the political upheavals of the 1960s in opposition to their left-wing peers. So the post-Second World War economic and demographic booms all over the world, but especially in what we call the global North, is one reason given for why students are so prominent in the story of the 1960s. By then, a huge baby boom meant a vast increase of the demand for higher education, as well as for the first time in many places, the inclusion of women in those cohorts. It's true that students as a category had more time to consider their government, their place in it, and their institution. Therefore, more time to protest against it. And the expansion of universities and students also presented more everyday problems. Many protests, even some of the most bombastic, and one or two of the ones we're going to talk about later in the talk, started over as things as mundane as the rise in student fees. Another explanation that's often floated is the generation gap, right? Students in the 1960s were protesting because their parents were old and conservative. There's some truth to that, certainly, especially in places like West Berlin, where students sometimes found themselves in lecture halls with literal former Nazis teaching them, or when they protested, specifically mentioned that their father's conduct in the Holocaust, for example. At the same time, historians and sociologists have also questioned the utility of generation as a category here and kind of in general. Mostly, generations are defined retroactively, and especially one's own belonging to a generation. I would also argue that the widening of the scope of our understanding to include the global student revolt also changes the simple "don't trust anyone over 30" explanation for student protest in the 60s. After all, while Japan and West Germany, generation meant a lot. But in places like Algeria or Mexico City, say, these questions were very different about generation, about age. And this brings me to the last theoretical, historiographical point about students in the 60s. Historians for quite some time have taken these movements in their national context and shown the flows of information and people across borders. At the drafting of the Port Huron Statement in 1962 by the US Students for a Democratic Society, for example, there was a West German exchange student named Michael Fester who was also present and involved in the discussions. This is, by the way, the same student who was also the early main contact between the Japanese and West German students, too. But this is not a phenomenon of the so-called First World alone, as students proved to be very mobile globally. For example, in France and its colonies in the 60s and 70s, students moved back and forth from the universities in North Africa to Paris, and in so doing exchanged not only these anti-colonial ideas, but also reforms that they made to their own institutions. And as a final note, and one of the main points I'd like to make in this discussion, is that the global nature of the 1960s is intertwined with the Vietnam War. Although I'm going to discuss two states that had somewhat direct involvement with the U.S. war in Indochina, Japan and West Germany were the two largest hosts of the U.S. military in this period, among other things. The imagined community of Vietnam solidarity or the global peace movement was also one of the most driving forces among student protesters to take the world events that they were witnessing and translate them to their own local circumstances. As we will see, a protest could be about fees and napalm at the same time. Now, to my part, I'll start in medias res. On the 8th of October 1967, a group of 2,000 student protesters wearing construction helmets approached Tokyo's Haneda Airport. The group, an alliance of three student factions calling themselves Sanpa Zengakuren, came to prevent the Prime Minister's planned visit to South Vietnam by occupying the runway physically. Unable to cross the bridge to reach a man-made island where the airfield sits, the students engaged in instead a 3-hour struggle against police, resulting in 300 arrests and one protester's death. Just 1 year later, on the 4th of November of 1968, a group of 1,000 West German students massed on Tegeler Weg, a street bordering the Charlottenburg neighborhood of West Berlin. The demonstrators, headed by student Christian Semmler of the Sozialistische Deutsche Studentenbund, or the Socialist German Student Union, the main student group in West Germany at the time, confusingly also SDS, but no relation, came to protest the trial of a lawyer and future urban guerrilla who was accused of participating in violent protests earlier that year. In what was later known as the Schlacht, or Battle of Tegeler Weg, protesters came clad in construction helmets, carrying wooden clubs, and they locked arms as they attempted to fight off police for over 2 hours, ultimately leaving 151 injured, including 21 of the protesters. Another year after that, in the fall of 1969, members of the radical Weathermen faction of SDS, the American SDS, in Chicago staged demonstrations with heavily armed police. On October 8th, 300 demonstrators wearing motorcycle and football helmets clashed in Lincoln Park. These were the so-called Days of Rage, intended to what they said was to bring the war home, meaning to make clear the violence in Vietnam by demonstrating against state violence domestically in the United States. Now, these three examples, separated by only 2 years, bring us to this image, which is perhaps one of the most famous of Japan's 1960s. It depicts a Japanese student protester engaged with riot police. He, and it was most often he, as protest in Japan's 1960s, was heavily gendered. He wears a bandana or a mask, he's carrying a wooden stave, and he's clad in a construction helmet with his student faction painted on it. And then this presentation is going to show how this image, the Zengakuren protester, became one of the primary modes in the late 1960s and 70s by which outside student movements understood their Japanese counterparts and how Japanese students presented themselves internationally. While historians have shown the importance of international and transnational connections between students in Japan specifically and elsewhere, the studies often privilege the United States. And here I'm going to introduce a European angle to the story. Now, in the late 1960s, as we've talked about, a lot of students were looking for ways in which they could have models for their protest internationally. There's a lot of this said about Che Guevara's call for, quote, many Vietnams, or his portrait circulating across borders, which historian Jeremy Pressholt has called a sort of transnational imagination. And again, that's the ability to take something that's global and apply it into your local circumstances. And in particular, this transnational imagination enabled the Japanese protester as a sort of active, masculine, and heroic model for other students around the world, struggling against the violence of their own state against protest, and also for the US military in Vietnam. And the first point I'd like to make about the exchange is how Japanese students actively sold their protest aesthetics to other groups around the world, and they found a lot of willing buyers. This began in 1967, continued through the 1970s, when Japanese student factions used English language materials and images of their own heroic protests to find like-minded groups abroad. And secondly, that observers from outside of Japan saw Japanese student protesters as that figure and tried to adapt it to their local conditions. And finally, in the late 1960s, it was not just an exchange of ideas and images, but important individuals met at a handful of these groups that shared ideas across borders. So, as with many global movements of the 1960s, a highly visible presence in the dominant cultural memory are students as well, just like the United States, just like in Germany, just like in many places. This was the All Japan Federation of Student Self-Governance, hence Zengakuren, shortened to that, which emerged in 1948 as, again, the college admissions exploded in post-war Japan. The organization itself was initially affiliated with the so-called Old Left of the Japanese Communist Party, but split with that party in 1958, becoming what we call a New Left, unaffiliated with the old structures and certainly unaffiliated with the Soviet Union. By 1964, members of Zengakuren had in fact split into further battling ideological factions. By the end of the decade, two main factions emerged. Chukakuha, or the Central Core faction, and Kakumaruha, the Revolutionary Marxist faction. Both of these groups could basically mobilize about 5,000 student protesters at any moment, but also had many, many thousands more non-mobilized students in other universities. It was at Haneda in 1967 that the helmeted demonstrator itself that you're seeing on your screen, that image first emerged. Even with the masked face, it was clear for whom the protester was affiliated. You can see here the helmet. You can see on this the white helmet in the center of your screen, the Chukaku faction, while Kakumaruha, also in the bottom right corner, had the large letter Z in front and the name written all along the side. Now, the final piece of this Zengakuren uniform was the Geibabo, a stick or a pole that could be used to hold a sign initially and quickly converted to hold back the police, as often happened, or to fight off a rival student faction. There are a lot of faction disputes in the Japanese New Left. The term itself is a contraction of Geibabo, Geibaruto, which is a phoneticization of the German Gewalt, which means force, and for the staff, meaning bo. Student protesters also employed a specific style, first popularized in the 1960s with protests against the Japan-US military treaty, which was often called the snake dance or the zigzag protest. Individuals linked arms, marched in a serpentine motion, supposedly exposing themselves less to riot police and their batons, and also made it harder to pull people out of the crowd itself. So therefore, we have the helmet, the stave, the twisting snake dance, were not only the most widely publicized image of Japan's 1960s, but also became something that could be presumably translated and implemented in other parts of the world. Now, while there had been some contact between Japanese student groups in the US, Japan, and West Germany between the 50s and the 60s, after Haneda, Zengakuren began sending out English language materials to their counterparts in the West, modeling these tactics in particular. You can see the cover of one of them here. This document, Zengakuren 20 Years Struggle, sought to explain the demonstration at the airport as part of a long history of student protest and a renewed fight against US aggression in Asia generally. Notably, this pamphlet included dozens of photos of helmeted protesters. And as a side note, I've actually seen this document in numerous Western archives, and in some of them, you can see that the photos of the Japanese students have been cut out, indicating that the West Germans specifically were using this as a sort of photo montage in their own protest materials. The second method of spreading the Japanese student image was through demonstration itself. In January of 1968, helmets and staves were once again widely publicized domestically and globally when students, citizens, and workers descended on Sasebo, the port in the south of Japan, to protest the porting of a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier from the United States. Almost exactly a month after the students were struggling in Sasebo in February 1968, over 5,000 students from around Europe and the so-called Third World gathered in Berlin to discuss the war in an event known as the Vietnam Congress. This mass meeting against the war and a collection of some of Western Europe's most notable New Left thinkers included mentions of Japanese student protesters, including one prominent Marxist economist, Ernst Mandel, who praised the Japanese tactics as good advice and noted the Japanese demonstrators motoring helmets and sticks in their hands and other means of defense against the police as a good way to also implement these tactics for West German anti-NATO demonstrations. In late 1968 and early 1969, over 70 universities all over Japan, groups of newly formed student faction alliances called Zenkyoto, or Joint Student Struggle Committees, occupied buildings and made demands for educational reforms. As mentioned earlier, these protests, although they became one of the largest moments of student protest in Japan's history, they were started over medical students arguing over higher fees and then began to take on larger anti-war, anti-imperial, anti-state, anti-government elements. At the height of the occupations in the University of Tokyo, Japanese television covered the siege of Tokyo University's Yasuda Auditorium for almost 24 hours live. The Tokyo University struggle, as it was known, was also international news. Zengakuren was, as the popular left-wing magazine Konkret in West Germany mentioned, the hardest student organization in the world. Uh, praising the students' hardness and the zigzagging protest, West Germans called the Tokyo Step. The author of this article held up the heroic Zengakuren student as an example for the counterparts in Europe. And then finally, as I mentioned, this was not just an imagined solidarity, but there was an exchange through meetings. In the fall of 1968, a coalition of factions in Japan held their own meeting against the war in Vietnam at the Chuo University in Tokyo. They proposed this meeting as a concrete step towards the internationalization of the movement against the conflict in Indochina. And almost 2,000 Japanese students attended the meeting, including 14 international representatives, one from SNCC, one from the American SDS, and a couple from the French Revolutionary Communist Youth League. The West Germans were invited and actually advertised as participants, but they got the invitation too late, so they did not attend. Among the other debates around the nature of the US war in Southeast Asia and around the globe, the meeting was also about tactics. It was the first meeting that an ultra-radical faction of the Japanese movement proposed creating a so-called Red Army to bring about the war from the periphery to the capitalist center. In a report about the meeting in 1968, the American SDS journal New Left Notes, Ken Cloak, a lawyer and a student, prominent student representative, reported being chastised by some of the Japanese counterparts that US students were squandering their chance at protesting exactly in the middle of the US war machine. And he agreed, saying that ultimately the SDS must take a more aggressive role in the world struggle and in the formation and development of international organizations. This was a way for the Japanese to convince their US counterparts that they should be doing more. Now, that ultra-radical faction Bund found this to be too little too late and proposed a sort of second international anti-imperial conference as a follow-up to the 1968 conference in fall of 1969. In an appeal for the conference published in Bund's weekly paper, the called for commitment for groups around the world to form a, quote, anti-imperial struggle vanguard. And they saw the components of that as being students in the American SDS, the Black Panther Party, and West German students in their own SDS. In a profile of the West German students, Senki described the crippling state crackdown of West German protesters as a confirmation that the struggle against the US war was becoming increasingly globalized. They, in Japan, noted that the fact that students in West Germany had, quote, armed themselves with geibabo and helmets and were waging a concrete struggle against those in power. After the meeting, the Senki published an interview with weatherman Michael Justensen, a radical faction again of SDS, who helped draft some of the group's founding documents in the American SDS's delegate. He clearly found Bund's arguments compelling, musing that weatherman should adopt slogans against US-Japanese military cooperation as part of their days of rage. The sole representative from West Germany was Christian Semmler, who was, of course, the leader of the Battle of Tegler-Weg. For his part, Semmler was keen to learn about the Japanese students about how to overcome factionalism within their own student organizations, which would disband in early 1970. In a series of articles in the spring of 1970, Semmler wrote that he was impressed with some of the Japanese New Left's joint struggle with workers, even commenting how there were many girls that he saw on the front line. Yet, Semmler was ultimately questions of groups like Zengakuren's quote-unquote samurai movie style of revolutionary politics had done anything at all to bring about an international anti-war front. Battles with riot police, he argued, brought the danger of ritualizing violence in a losing struggle against a vastly superior opponent, he reasoned. And I'm going to wrap up here. A few notes in conclusion. Japanese demonstrating tactics. And I'll leave it on this image of Yoko Ono and John Lennon wearing, again, this sort of costume of international protest based in Japanese aesthetics. The Japanese demonstration tactics themselves were part of a reciprocal transnational exchange and not wholly homegrown. Zengakuren was also borrowing from many different sources. Radicals in Bund hoped to capitalize on the direct action of their peers. They held their own days of rage, as they called them, in Osaka and Tokyo in 1969. This was also shown in language. Again, using in these terms, they would build what they called barricado in 1969 in Tokyo University, borrowed from the French. And as Bill Morotti has shown, the use of the German word Gewalt, as opposed to a homegrown Japanese word for violence, was a reaction to the press using this term boryoku, or violence, which had a more anarchistic, meaningless connotation to it. And they were reclaiming their use of initiative in politics by claiming it as Gewaltto, as counter-violence to the state's violence. And second, while many radicals found the Zengakuren student to be an inspiration, it would be incorrect to blame Japan for violence in the US or West Germany, as it has been to blame the so-called Third World for violence in the First. Through a number of factors, Japanese anti-war movement, especially among students, radical ideas of counter-violence much earlier than their peers. Yet, radicals in many of these places were having the same debates at similar time. At the apex of this conversation in the late 1960s, the Zengakuren sort of heroic street fighter appealed so much in West Germany and the US precisely because it provided one solution to factional splits and debates about violence of the state in different student movements. That said, in praise and adoption of the model, one can also see an orientalized and masculinized concept of Japanese protests. Zemmler's views about samurai and fascination with girls were doing the fighting is just one example. It's important that the Zengakuren street fighter was something disseminated from Japan and adopted in Europe and the US. I'd also like to note that even with the orientalization of Japanese students in solidarity, it's also a trope to imagine that Japanese culture is only adapting and only absorbing. In fact, they had a direct influence on the way that student movements operated in other places. And I've talked a little too long here, so I'm going to pass it back to my colleague Kate for any questions from her or the audience.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was fascinating, and I'm going to take my privilege as the person with the microphone to, as someone who thinks mostly about the 18th century and really enjoys the opportunity to go to the 1960s with you, but I can't linger here. One of the elements of the Virginia Declaration of Rights was George Mason stating that the freedom of the press was the quote bulwark of liberty. He was imagining that in a world without magazines or photography or live press coverage 24 hours a day, or all of these kind of alternative, decentralized means of communication. What is the impact that you see on different press and communication technologies and the ways in which suddenly individual political actors, citizens of various countries, could become the media themselves in this period?
Yeah, thanks for that. It's a great question. I think there's a couple of facets to that. The first one, starting from the sort of general historiographical point, or sort of, history point of this history of the 60s. First of all, it's a lot easier in the 60s to get your materials across borders. It is easier to disseminate stuff. It in the Japanese context as well. These sort of protest movements, these moments of real strife between university students, their administrators, and the state, are these sort of the first sort of media moments in Japanese television history. There's another one that I didn't mention, but a siege at a Japanese ski lodge by some radicals is also sort of this must-watch event that sort of has wall-to-wall coverage. But in a sort of, beyond the sort of technological, it's easier to globalize these sort of, vague globalization arguments. For these student protesters, one of their main concerns is the fact that the major press is often sympathetic, but ultimately comes down against them. And there's a lot of right-wing press that does a lot to, antagonize student protesters back and forth. There's a lot of radicalization, especially in West Germany, where the right-wing press becomes this villain in and of itself. But a lot of the materials that I've shown you here, coming from the Japanese student protesters, is presumed to be an alternate media form. And the way that the mimeograph, easy copying, access to easy ways of reproduction, becomes this way to sort of present their ideas, interact with each other, outside of what the sort of mainstream media is saying in their states. And I think it's very useful to look at the Japanese context here too, because when they interact with the world, they have to interact in English. And it's interesting to see the development of sort of English language materials presented in magazines, sent directly to who they think their peers are, as a way of sort of uh, making a movement of alternative media sources. Um, and I will also mention that many of these alternative media sources, if you were a comrade in the struggle, it was cheaper. They charged you a lot less for the magazine.
All right. Well, okay, so this half hour just flew by. I would like to ask you like 60 more questions. But for those of you who, like me, have become fascinated with your work, do you have any other projects upcoming, or anywhere people can read more?
Yeah, I have a couple of pieces published about this. I'm working on a piece specifically about Japanese and West German bases, because again, mentioned this is a huge moment of uh, where the U.S. military is interacting specifically with these groups and anti-war GIs on these bases. They produced a huge amount of underground newspaper aspects of this that went back and forth. So I'm working on that. Hopefully, that will come out soon. But you know other materials posted as well.
All right. Well, keep your eyes peeled, everyone listening at home. And thank you all for joining us for this edition of History Bites. We'll see you back here with another Feast for Your Brains on the third Wednesday of next month, which will be June 18th, when we'll be joined by Dr. Leslie Shipley, who will be discussing the history of Black protest art. And in the meantime, you can like and subscribe if you would like. It really helps our channel. Um, and please do keep the conversation going in the comments and on our social media. And as always, stay hungry.